Sarah Mitchell walked into the crowded coffee shop near the university campus, her long sleeves carefully pulled down to cover the marks on her arms. At 28, she had learned to dress in ways that hid the reminders of her past life. The barista, a young college student with bright pink hair, smiled warmly as Sarah approached the counter. "What can I get you today?" the girl asked cheerfully. "Just a black coffee, please," Sarah replied softly, her voice carrying a slight rasp that most people attributed to a cold or too much talking. As she waited for her order, Sarah noticed a group of college students at a nearby table, engaged in a heated discussion about military conflicts overseas. Their voices grew louder as they debated whether women should be allowed in combat roles. "Women just aren't built for that kind of violence," declared a young man with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes. "They don't have the physical or mental strength to handle real combat situations." His female companion nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And honestly, I think most women who claim they've been in combat are probably exaggerating. Like, how many have actually seen real action?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard these conversations countless times since returning to civilian life 3 years ago. The assumptions people made about women in the military, especially about combat veterans, never failed to sting. "I mean, think about it," the young man continued, leaning back in his chair with confidence. "Most military women probably just work in offices or kitchens. The idea that they're out there fighting alongside men is probably just propaganda." The barista called Sarah's name, and she stepped forward to collect her coffee. As she turned to leave, she accidentally bumped into an elderly man who was walking with a cane. Her reflexes kicked in instantly, and she caught both him and his falling cane with movements that were fluid and precise. "Thank you, young lady," the man said gratefully. "You've got quick reflexes there." Sarah helped him to a nearby chair, her movements efficient and careful. As she did, the elderly man noticed something that made him pause. There was something familiar about the way she carried herself, the way she scanned the room even while helping him. "Were you military?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Yes, sir, Army." The man's eyes lit up with understanding. "I could tell. My son served too. Afghanistan, 2 tours." His expression grew more serious. "Did you deploy?" "3 times, Sarah answered simply, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The conversation at the nearby table had grown even more animated. The young woman was now gesturing dramatically as she spoke. "I just think it's ridiculous when women try to act tough and pretend they've been through things they haven't. Like, we all know most of them never actually faced any real danger." The elderly man followed Sarah's gaze and frowned. "Ignorant kids," he muttered. "They have no idea what they're talking about." Sarah shrugged slightly. "They're young. They don't know any better." "Maybe," the man said, studying her face carefully. "But sometimes young people need to be educated about reality." Sarah shook her head gently. "It's not worth it. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway." The elderly man looked puzzled. "Believe what?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee, considering whether to explain. The truth was, she had stopped trying to correct people's assumptions about her military service long ago. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted than to deal with the skepticism, the invasive questions, or worse, the pity that often followed. "My name is Frank," the elderly man said, extending his hand. "Frank Morrison, and I have a feeling there's more to your story than meets the eye." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that didn't go unnoticed. Frank smiled knowingly. "Sarah, I've been around military folks my whole life. Served in Vietnam myself, and my boy just came back from his 2nd deployment. I can spot a combat veteran from across a room, and you've got that look." "What look?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew what he meant. "The look of someone who's seen things, real things. The way you scanned this room when you walked in, how you positioned yourself with your back to the wall, the way you helped me just now. That's not just military training, that's combat experience." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She appreciated Frank's recognition, but it also reminded her of how invisible her service felt in civilian life. People looked at her and saw a young woman, maybe a college student or someone with an office job. They didn't see the 3 combat deployments, the firefights, the lives lost and saved. The college students were still talking, their voices carrying across the coffee shop. "I bet half these women who claim they were in combat never even left the base," the young man was saying. "It's all about attention and trying to seem special." Frank's face darkened. Those kids are really starting to irritate me. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. It's okay, Frank, really, I'm used to it. But Frank wasn't ready to let it go. You shouldn't have to be used to it. Respect is something that should be given automatically to those who've served, especially those who've served in combat. Sarah appreciated his sentiment, but she had learned that demanding respect rarely worked. Instead, she had chosen to live quietly, focusing on her studies and trying to build a normal life. She was working toward a degree in social work, hoping to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. The coffee shop was getting busier as the afternoon wore on. More students were arriving and the noise level was rising. Sarah noticed how her body automatically tensed with the increased activity and chaos around her. It was one of those invisible reminders of her service that no one else could see. Frank seemed to notice her subtle reaction to the crowding. Gets overwhelming sometimes, doesn't it? Sarah nodded, impressed by his perceptiveness. Sometimes. Loud crowds can be challenging. My son deals with the same thing, Frank said quietly. Says crowded places make him feel like he needs to find all the exits. It was exactly what Sarah did every time she entered a new space, though she had never articulated it quite that way. The need to know where every exit was located, to position herself strategically, to remain aware of everyone around her. These were habits that had kept her alive overseas, but they made civilian life feel complicated and exhausting. The young college students finally finished their drinks and gathered their belongings to leave. As they passed by Sarah and Frank's table, the young woman looked directly at Sarah with a dismissive expression that suggested she had been listening to their conversation and found it unimpressive. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself back at the same coffee shop, having unconsciously developed a routine that felt safe and predictable. She had chosen a table in the corner where she could see the entire room, a habit that Frank had correctly identified during their first meeting. Today she was reviewing notes for her psychology class when she heard familiar voices near the counter. The same group of college students had returned, and they were even more animated than before. This time they had been joined by several friends, and their conversation had expanded to include broader topics about military service and what they perceived as exaggerated war stories. I'm telling you, most of these so-called war heroes are just looking for attention, the young man from before was saying to his expanded audience, especially the women. They know people will give them special treatment if they claim they were in combat. Sarah kept her eyes focused on her textbook, but her jaw clenched involuntarily. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent most of her time trying to avoid any special treatment or attention related to her military service. She worked hard to blend in, to appear as normal as possible, precisely because she didn't want to deal with the complex reactions her service record often provoked. A new voice joined the conversation, belonging to a young woman with a confident tone. My cousin was in the military and she said most women never actually see combat. They get sent to safe bases and do administrative work, but then they come home and act like they were on the front lines. Sarah's pen stopped moving across her notebook. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times, but today something about it felt particularly grating. Maybe it was because she hadn't slept well the night before, plagued by the dreams that still visited her sometimes. Maybe it was because she had just received an email from her former unit about a memorial service for a friend who hadn't made it home. I think they should have to prove it, another student chimed in, like show evidence that they were actually in combat situations. Too many people are claiming experiences they never had. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push down the familiar surge of frustration. The evidence they were asking for was written across her body in scars and damage that she worked hard to keep hidden. It was documented in medical records that she preferred not to discuss. It lived in the memories that she carried every day. Memories that shaped how she moved through the world, but that she couldn't simply display like a diploma on a wall. The conversation continued, with each participant adding their own theories about military service and the authenticity of women's combat experiences. Sarah found herself thinking about her fellow soldiers, both the ones who had made it home and the ones who hadn't. She thought about Maria, who had saved Sarah's life during an ambush outside Kandahar. She thought about Jennifer, who had died in Sarah's arms after an IED explosion tore through their convoy. These weren't stories she could easily share with strangers in a coffee shop. They weren't experiences she could use to win arguments or prove points. They were sacred memories heavy with loss and survival, That deserved more respect than to be used as evidence in a debate with college students who had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult exam. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her therapist, reminding her about their appointment the following day. It was a weekly routine that helped her process the ongoing challenges of civilian life, including moments exactly like this one. Dr. Rivera had taught her techniques for managing the anger and frustration that could arise when people dismissed or minimized her experiences. Remember, Dr. Rivera often said, their ignorance doesn't diminish your truth. You don't owe anyone your story, and you don't need their validation to know the value of your service. But knowing this intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. Sarah had learned to carry her military identity quietly, but that didn't mean the carrying was always easy. Some days the weight of being invisible felt heavier than others. The group of students had moved to a larger table, and their conversation had attracted the attention of other coffee shop patrons. Sarah noticed an older woman at a nearby table listening with obvious disapproval, and a middle-aged man who kept shaking his head at their comments. It seemed that not everyone in the coffee shop agreed with the students' perspectives. "You know what really bothers me?" the original young man continued, his voice carrying clearly across the space. "When women try to act tough and intimidating, like we can all see through the act. Real soldiers don't need to prove anything to anyone." Sarah almost laughed at the irony of that statement. If anything, she spent most of her energy trying to appear less tough, less aware, less prepared for danger than she actually was. She had learned that displaying her real capabilities often made people uncomfortable or suspicious. It was easier to let them underestimate her than to deal with the complicated reactions that came with showing her true skills. A new customer entered the coffee shop, and Sarah's trained eye automatically assessed him as he walked in. Military bearing, alert posture, strategic choice of seating. Another veteran, she suspected, though she made no move to acknowledge the recognition. This was another aspect of post-military life that civilians rarely understood: the constant, subtle communication between veterans who recognized each other in public spaces. The man caught her eye briefly and nodded almost imperceptibly. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. In that moment, Sarah felt less alone in the coffee shop full of people who couldn't understand her experience. The students' conversation had shifted to specific conflicts and their opinions about military strategy. Sarah found their analysis simultaneously amusing and irritating, given that it was clearly based on movies and news reports rather than any real understanding of combat operations. They spoke with such confidence about situations they had never faced, making judgments about decisions they had never had to make. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her study group. They were meeting later to work on a project about trauma-informed care and social work practice. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was studying to help other people process trauma while sitting in a coffee shop listening to people dismiss the very experiences that had shaped her own understanding of trauma and resilience. She began gathering her books and papers, deciding that staying any longer would only increase her frustration. As she prepared to leave, she overheard one final comment that stopped her in her tracks. "I just think if someone really had been in combat, you'd be able to tell," the young woman said confidently. "Like there would be obvious signs. People who've been through real trauma don't just look normal and blend in with everyone else." Sarah paused at the table where she had been sitting, her hand resting on her backpack. The comment revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma and survival that she felt momentarily speechless. The idea that trauma victims should be easily identifiable, that they should wear their experiences like visible badges, showed just how little these students understood about the realities of military service and its aftermath. The truth was exactly the opposite. Most combat veterans worked incredibly hard to appear normal, to blend in, to function in civilian society despite carrying experiences that had fundamentally changed them. The ability to look normal while managing invisible wounds was often a testament to their strength, not evidence that their experiences weren't real. The following Tuesday evening, Sarah was walking across campus toward the library when she heard shouting coming from the direction of the student parking lot. Her body responded before her mind had fully processed the sound, muscles tensing, and senses sharpening in ways that had once kept her alive in dangerous places. She quickened her pace toward the commotion, despite the part of her mind that suggested she should walk in the opposite direction and avoid getting involved. As she rounded the corner of the engineering building, she saw a scene that made her blood run cold. 3 men had surrounded a young woman near the poorly lit section of the parking lot. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the woman's fear and the aggressive postures of the men blocking her path to her car. "Come on, don't be like that," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying the artificial friendliness that Sarah had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "We just want to talk to you." The woman was clearly trying to get away, but the men had positioned themselves strategically to prevent her escape. Sarah recognized the tactics immediately. It was a classic containment formation designed to control someone's movement while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could call campus security, but by the time they arrived, the situation might have escalated beyond help. She could try to attract attention from other students, but the parking lot was relatively isolated, and she didn't see anyone else nearby. The most direct approach would be to intervene herself, but that would require revealing capabilities she usually kept hidden. The woman's voice cracked as she spoke. "Please, I just want to go to my car. My boyfriend is expecting me." "Your boyfriend isn't here now," another man replied with a laugh that made Sarah's stomach turn. "Don't worry, we'll take good care of you." Sarah made her decision. She walked quickly but deliberately toward the group, pulling out her phone and calling out in a voice that carried clearly across the parking lot. "Hey, Emma, there you are," she called out, pretending to recognize the trapped woman. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Marcus is waiting for us at the library." The 3 men turned toward Sarah with expressions of annoyance and suspicion. Sarah continued walking toward them with confidence, keeping her phone visible and maintaining eye contact with the woman who looked confused but hopeful. "I think you've got the wrong person," one of the men said, stepping slightly toward Sarah in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. Sarah didn't slow down or change her trajectory. "No, that's definitely Emma. We're supposed to be studying together tonight." She looked directly at the woman. "Your brother called and said he'd pick you up at the library instead of here." The woman caught on quickly. "Oh, right, I forgot. Thanks for finding me." "Excuse me," the largest of the 3 men said, moving to block Sarah's path. "We were having a private conversation here." Sarah stopped about 6 feet away from him, close enough to act if necessary, but far enough to maintain tactical advantage. Her posture was relaxed but balanced, and she kept her hands free and visible. "That's okay," she said pleasantly. "Emma and I really need to get going anyway. Her brother worries when she's late." The man stepped closer, clearly intending to use his size to intimidate her. "I don't think you understand the situation here." Sarah's voice remained calm and friendly, but something in her eyes changed. "I understand it perfectly. Emma is coming with me now, and you 3 are going to find something else to do with your evening." The tension in the air was palpable. The men had expected to deal with 1 frightened woman, not 2, and Sarah's unexpected confidence had disrupted their plan. They exchanged glances, clearly trying to decide how to proceed. "Look, lady," the 3rd man said, "this isn't your business. Why don't you just keep walking?" Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate the suggestion, but Emma and I are leaving together. Right now." She gestured for the woman to move toward her, creating a clear path away from the men. The woman hesitated for only a moment before taking several quick steps toward Sarah. The largest man moved to intercept them, and Sarah's demeanor shifted subtly. Her stance became more balanced, her hands positioned where they could react quickly, and her voice took on a quality that suggested she was not someone to be underestimated. "I really don't recommend that," she said quietly. There was something in her tone that made all 3 men pause. It wasn't anger or fear. It was the calm certainty of someone who had faced much worse situations and knew exactly how they would handle whatever came next. The leader of the group studied Sarah's face more carefully, and she could see him reassessing the situation. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider his approach. "Emma, stay close to me," Sarah said without taking her eyes off the men. "We're going to walk to the library together." She began moving, keeping herself positioned between the woman and the 3 men. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, and she maintained constant awareness of all 3 men's positions without appearing to stare at any of them directly. The men followed for a few steps, but something about Sarah's confidence and the growing possibility that other students might appear had changed the dynamic. They eventually stopped following, though Sarah could feel their eyes on her back as she and the woman walked away. They didn't speak until they were well inside the brightly lit area near the library entrance. Only then did the woman break down, her hands shaking as the adrenaline of the encounter hit her. "Thank you," she whispered, tears starting to flow. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." Sarah guided her to a bench near the library entrance. "You're safe now. My name is Sarah, by the way." "I'm Jessica," the woman replied, trying to compose herself. "How did you know what to do? You seemed so calm and sure of yourself." Sarah considered how to answer. "I've had some training in handling difficult situations." Jessica looked at her with new curiosity. "What kind of training?" "Military training," Sarah answered simply. Jessica's eyes widened. "You were in the military? Did you ever? Were you in combat?" It was the same question Sarah had been hearing in various forms for months, but this time it felt different. This time it came from someone who had just experienced firsthand why such training mattered, why the skills Sarah had learned overseas were still relevant in civilian life. "Yes," Sarah answered quietly. "I was." Jessica stared at her with something approaching awe. "Those guys were really scared of you. I could tell. How did you do that?" Sarah almost smiled. "Confidence is often more effective than aggression. People who are looking for easy targets usually back down when they realize they've found something else entirely." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes while Jessica gathered herself. Finally, she asked the question that Sarah had been expecting. "Can I ask you something? Why don't you talk about it more? If I could handle a situation like that, I think I'd want everyone to know." Sarah considered the question carefully. Because most people don't really want to know. They want simple stories that make them feel comfortable, not complicated truths that challenge their assumptions. Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" "Most people prefer to think that women like me don't exist," Sarah explained. "They're more comfortable believing that combat is something that happens to other people, in other places, and doesn't change the people who experience it. When they meet someone like me, it challenges their assumptions about a lot of things." Jessica was quiet for a moment, processing this. "That seems really unfair." "It is what it is," Sarah replied. "I didn't serve to get recognition or to make other people comfortable. I served because it needed to be done." Word of the parking lot incident spread quickly through the campus community, though the details became increasingly distorted with each retelling. By the end of the week, Sarah had heard at least 6 different versions of what had supposedly happened, ranging from a simple case of mistaken identity to an elaborate story involving martial arts and multiple attackers. What bothered Sarah most wasn't the exaggeration of the story, but the fact that Jessica had apparently told several people about Sarah's military background. While Sarah appreciated Jessica's gratitude, she had hoped to maintain her privacy about her service record. Now she found herself dealing with unexpected attention from students and faculty who had heard various versions of both the incident and her military history. The most uncomfortable moment came during her social work ethics class, when Professor E. Martinez brought up the topic of intervention and bystander responsibility. Sarah had been sitting quietly in her usual seat near the back of the classroom when she realized that several of her classmates were looking at her with obvious curiosity. "I understand we have someone in our class who recently demonstrated excellent crisis intervention skills," Professor Martinez said, his eyes settling on Sarah. "Would you be willing to share your thoughts on the ethical considerations involved in deciding whether to intervene in a potentially dangerous situation?" Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had specifically chosen social work as a field where she could help people without having to discuss her own background extensively. The idea of becoming a case study in her own classroom was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. "I think the most important thing is assessing whether your intervention will actually improve the situation or potentially make it worse," she answered carefully, "and considering whether you have the skills and resources to handle the consequences of getting involved." "That's very practical advice," the professor replied. "I imagine your military background gives you a different perspective on risk assessment than most civilians would have." Sarah noticed several classmates exchanging glances and whispered comments. She had successfully avoided discussing her military service in class for almost 2 semesters, and now it was becoming the focus of attention in exactly the way she had hoped to prevent. Military training does emphasize the importance of understanding your capabilities before committing to action, she admitted reluctantly. Were you deployed overseas? Asked a classmate named David, who had previously shown little interest in Sarah's contributions to class discussions. Sarah hesitated. Yes, I was. Where did you serve? Another student chimed in. Afghanistan, primarily, Sarah answered, hoping that brief responses might discourage further questions. Did you see combat? David pressed. The classroom fell silent, and Sarah could feel everyone's eyes on her. This was the moment she had been dreading since she started school. The moment when her carefully maintained privacy would be invaded by well-meaning but intrusive curiosity. Yes, she said simply. The follow-up questions came rapidly from different parts of the classroom. What was it like? Were you scared? Did you have to kill anyone? How many deployments? Why did you join the military? Professor Martinez raised his hand to quiet the class. I think we should respect Sarah's privacy and return to our discussion of ethical intervention principles. Sarah was grateful for the intervention, but she could see that the damage was done. Her classmates now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and the kind of careful attention that people often directed toward individuals they perceived as potentially dangerous or unpredictable. After class, several students approached her with questions and comments. Most were well-intentioned, but Sarah found herself in the exhausting position of having to navigate their assumptions and expectations about what her military service meant. I think it's so cool that you were a soldier, said Rebecca, a classmate who had never spoken to Sarah before. You must have so many interesting stories. Sarah forced a polite smile. It was mostly just a job, like any other. But you were in combat, Rebecca persisted. That must have been so intense. What was the scariest thing that happened to you? Sarah felt the familiar weight of having to decide how much truth she was willing to share. The honest answer would involve describing experiences that would likely disturb Rebecca and create more questions than it answered. The dishonest answer would minimize experiences that had fundamentally shaped who Sarah was as a person. Combat situations are mostly about training and teamwork, she said diplomatically. Individual experiences are less important than unit cohesion and following procedures. Rebecca looked slightly disappointed by the generic response, but Sarah had learned that most people who asked for military stories weren't actually prepared for the reality of what those stories contained. They wanted sanitized versions that would satisfy their curiosity without challenging their comfortable assumptions about war and its consequences. Over the following days, Sarah noticed changes in how people interacted with her on campus. Some students seemed intimidated and gave her extra space in hallways and elevators. Others approached her with an almost aggressive friendliness, as if her military service was something they needed to acknowledge and praise. A few seemed to view her as a potential source of entertainment, asking leading questions designed to prompt dramatic revelations about her deployments. The most difficult interactions came from people who wanted to debate military policy or express their political opinions about various conflicts. Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of being expected to defend or explain decisions that had been made far above her pay grade by people who had access to information and perspectives that she had never possessed. I don't understand why we were even in Afghanistan in the first place, declared Marcus, a political science major who had cornered Sarah after her research methods class. The whole thing was just a waste of money and lives. Sarah stared at him for a moment, trying to decide how to respond. She could engage in a political debate, but that would require explaining complexities that Marcus probably wasn't interested in understanding. She could defend the mission, but that would mean taking responsibility for policy decisions she had never been involved in making. Or she could try to redirect the conversation away from politics entirely. I was there to do a job and support my unit, she said finally. Political questions were above my pay grade. Marcus looked unsatisfied with this response. But you must have opinions about whether the mission was justified. My opinions about policy aren't really relevant, Sarah replied. I was a soldier, not a politician. This seemed to frustrate Marcus even more. But how can you separate your personal beliefs from your actions? Didn't you ever question what you were doing over there? Sarah felt a familiar surge of irritation. Marcus was asking her to provide simple answers to questions that had no simple answers, to reduce complex experiences to sound bites that would fit his political worldview. I questioned a lot of things, she admitted. But questioning policy and doing your job aren't mutually exclusive. Soldiers don't have the luxury of only following orders they personally agree with. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Marcus pressing for more definitive statements about the rightness or wrongness of various military actions. Sarah realized that he wasn't actually interested in her perspective as someone who had lived through these experiences. He wanted her to validate his existing opinions or provide ammunition for his political arguments. This pattern repeated itself multiple times over the following week. People approached Sarah expecting her to serve as either a defender of military policy or a critic of it, but few seemed interested in the nuanced reality of being an individual soldier, navigating complex situations with limited information and multiple competing priorities. 3 weeks after the parking lot incident, Sarah was surprised to receive an invitation to speak at a campus event about women in the military. The request came from the Women's Leadership Council, a student organization that hosted monthly speakers on various topics related to gender equality and women's achievements. Sarah's initial instinct was to decline politely. Public speaking about her military service was something she had avoided since returning to civilian life, partly because she preferred privacy, but mostly because she had learned that most audiences weren't prepared for honest discussions about the realities of combat service. However, the invitation letter mentioned that the event had been specifically requested by several students who had heard about her intervention in the parking lot incident. They wanted to hear from someone who could speak authentically about women in combat roles, particularly in light of recent policy changes that had opened more military positions to female service members. After discussing it with Dr. Rivera during her weekly therapy session, Sarah decided to accept the invitation. Dr. Rivera had been encouraging her to find ways to process her experiences that didn't require hiding from them entirely. You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with, Dr. Rivera reminded her, but you might find it helpful to control the narrative for once, instead of always responding to other people's assumptions and questions. The event was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the university's main auditorium. Sarah arrived early to familiarize herself with the space and check the microphone system. Her military training had taught her the importance of understanding her environment before any kind of presentation or mission. As students began filtering into the auditorium, Sarah recognized several faces from her classes and from around campus. She was surprised to see Frank Morrison, the elderly veteran she had met at the coffee shop, sitting in the third row with what appeared to be his adult son. The moderator, a senior named Ashley who served as president of the Women's Leadership Council, introduced Sarah with a brief biography that focused primarily on her academic achievements and current studies in social work. The introduction mentioned her military service, but didn't include details about her deployments or combat experience. Sarah stepped up to the podium and looked out at an audience of about 70 people, mostly college students with a handful of faculty members and community members scattered throughout the auditorium. She had prepared remarks about leadership and teamwork, topics that felt safer than discussing combat directly. "Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight," she began. "I want to start by saying that every service member's experience is different. What I'm sharing tonight is my perspective, not a universal truth about military service or women in combat roles." She talked about the decision to join the Army after high school, motivated partly by a desire to serve her country, and partly by the practical benefits of military education funding. She described the training process and the gradual realization that she had found something she was genuinely good at. "Military service taught me things about leadership that I don't think I could have learned anywhere else," she continued. "In combat situations, leadership isn't about authority or rank. It's about competence, reliability, and the ability to make good decisions under pressure." A student in the front row raised her hand. "Can you tell us about a specific leadership challenge you faced during your deployments?" Sarah paused, considering how to answer. She had dozens of stories she could tell, but most of them involved details that would be difficult for a civilian audience to process. She chose one that illustrated her point about leadership without requiring graphic descriptions of violence. During my second deployment, I was leading a patrol in a small village outside Kandahar. We had been working with local leaders to identify security threats, and we had developed good relationships with most of the community. But there was one afternoon when we received intelligence about a possible IED in the area where we were supposed to conduct a routine patrol. Sarah noticed that the auditorium had become completely quiet. Even students who had been whispering or checking their phones were now paying complete attention. The decision I had to make was whether to cancel the patrol, which would have disappointed the local leaders who were expecting us and potentially damaged relationships we had been building for months, or to proceed with additional precautions that might provide protection, but would also send a message of distrust to the community. A faculty member in the back raised his hand. "What did you decide?" "I decided to modify the patrol route and timing, and to bring additional personnel for security. It turned out that the intelligence was accurate. There was an IED along our original route, but by changing our approach rather than canceling entirely, we were able to maintain our commitments to the community while keeping everyone safe." "Were you scared?" asked a young woman near the middle of the auditorium. Sarah considered the question carefully. Fear is a normal response to dangerous situations. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to function effectively despite it. Military training teaches you to channel fear into heightened awareness and better decision-making. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics from military culture to the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. Sarah found herself being more open than she had expected, partly because the audience seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging her experiences. Then a student near the back of the auditorium raised his hand. Sarah recognized him immediately. It was the same young man from the coffee shop who had been so vocal about his opinions regarding women in combat. "I have a question about authenticity," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "How do we know that women who claim to have combat experience actually have it? I mean, anyone can say they were in combat, but how do we verify these claims?" The auditorium fell silent. Sarah could feel the tension in the room as other students recognized the challenging nature of the question. Ashley, the moderator, looked uncomfortable and appeared ready to intervene. Sarah held up a hand to indicate that she was willing to address the question. "That's an interesting question. What kind of verification are you looking for?" The young man shifted in his seat, perhaps not expecting such a direct response. "Well, I mean, if someone really was in combat, there would be evidence, right? Documentation, witnesses, maybe physical evidence." "You mean like scars?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm and conversational. "Well, yeah, potentially. Or medical records, commendations, things like that." Sarah nodded slowly. "I see. So you're suggesting that combat veterans should be prepared to provide physical proof of their experiences to satisfy the curiosity of people who question their authenticity?" Several students in the audience turned to look at the questioner, and Sarah could see that some of them were beginning to understand the problematic nature of his demand for evidence. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," the young man said, his confidence wavering slightly. "I just think that with so many people claiming experiences they didn't have, there should be some way to separate fact from fiction." Sarah walked out from behind the podium, moving closer to the audience. "Let me ask you something. If I showed you my medical records from Walter Reed Army Medical Center, would that satisfy your need for proof? If I described the surgeries I had after an IED explosion damaged my left leg and caused internal injuries, would that make my service more real to you?" The young man didn't answer, but Sarah could see that she had his complete attention. "What if I told you about the shrapnel scars on my back and arms, or the hearing damage from explosions, or the physical therapy I needed to regain full mobility? Would that be enough evidence, or would you need to see the scars themselves?" The auditorium was completely silent now. Sarah could see that her questions were making people uncomfortable, but she continued. "Here's what I want you to understand," she said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that commanded attention. "The women and men who serve in combat don't owe you proof of their experiences. We don't carry our service records around to satisfy the curiosity of people who question our authenticity. And we certainly don't display our physical and emotional scars as evidence for people who think we need to prove ourselves. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The assumption that women are lying about their combat experience says more about your prejudices than it does about their honesty, and the demand for physical proof of trauma is not only inappropriate, it's cruel. Frank Morrison stood up from his seat in the third row. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak on this topic. "My son served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He came home with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and injuries that aren't visible to people who don't know what to look for." Sarah is absolutely right. Veterans don't owe anyone proof of their service, and the assumption that they're lying is insulting and harmful. Other audience members began nodding in agreement. Sarah could see that the dynamic in the room had shifted significantly. "I'd like to show you something," Sarah said, making a decision that surprised even herself. She rolled up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing a series of surgical scars and what was clearly shrapnel damage along her forearm. The young man who had asked the question looked genuinely shocked. Several other audience members gasped audibly. "This is from an IED explosion outside Kandahar in 2019, Sarah said matter-of-factly. 3 members of my unit were killed in that attack. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital and 3 months in physical therapy. Is this enough proof for you, or would you like to see more?" The young man shook his head, looking pale and uncomfortable. "No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to what?" Sarah asked, rolling her sleeve back down. "Question my honesty? Demand that I prove my service to you? Suggest that women like me are probably lying about our experiences?" "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice barely audible. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you this because your assumptions are harmful, and they affect real people. Every time you question whether a woman's combat experience is authentic, you're contributing to an environment that forces veterans to choose between hiding their service or defending their credibility." She returned to the podium and looked out at the audience. "The truth is, most combat veterans don't want to talk about their experiences in detail. We don't share our stories to impress people or gain attention. When we do share, it's usually because we think it might help someone else or serve a larger purpose." The remaining question and answer session was much more respectful and thoughtful. Students asked about resources for veterans, about how civilians could better support military families, and about the challenges of translating military skills to civilian careers. After the event ended, several people approached Sarah to thank her for speaking and to ask follow-up questions. The young man who had challenged her authenticity waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching the stage. "Excuse me," the young man said quietly, his earlier confidence completely gone. "I wanted to apologize properly. I was completely out of line with my question tonight." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse rather than the defensive attitude she might have expected. "What's your name?" "Tyler," he replied. "Tyler Matthews. I'm a junior in political science. Tyler, can I ask you something? What made you think it was appropriate to question my authenticity in front of 70 people?" Tyler looked down at his feet. "Honestly, I think I was embarrassed. A few weeks ago, you and I were in the same coffee shop, and I was saying some really ignorant things about women in the military. I think when I saw you up there tonight talking about your service, I felt defensive about being wrong." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "So instead of admitting you had been wrong, you decided to double down and challenge me publicly?" "Yeah," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was stupid and mean, and I'm really sorry." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how to respond. She could accept his apology and move on, or she could use this as a teaching moment. Dr. Rivera had often talked about the importance of finding constructive ways to address ignorance rather than simply dismissing it. "Tyler, can I ask you to do something for me?" "Of course," he replied immediately. "I want you to think about why you assumed I was lying before you had any evidence to support that assumption. And I want you to consider how your attitude might affect other veterans you encounter in the future." Tyler nodded seriously. "I will, I promise." "Good. And Tyler, the things I showed you tonight, the scars, the medical history, that's not something I usually share with people. I did it tonight because I thought it might help you and others understand something important. But I want you to know that no veteran should have to expose their trauma to prove their service to you or anyone else." "I understand," Tyler said, "and I'm going to do better." Frank Morrison approached as Tyler was walking away. "That was well handled," he said approvingly. "Both the presentation and the way you dealt with that young man's challenge. Thank you. Frank, I was surprised to see you here tonight." "My son Michael wanted to come," Frank explained, gesturing toward a man in his 30s who was standing nearby. "He's been struggling with some of the same issues you talked about. The transition back to civilian life, dealing with people's assumptions and questions." Michael stepped forward and extended his hand. "Thank you for speaking tonight. It helped to hear someone articulate some of the things I've been feeling but couldn't express." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the direct eye contact that marked him as a fellow veteran. "What branch and deployments?" "Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan between 2020 and 2022, he replied. "I've been having a hard time with college since I got out. People don't really understand the experience, and I've been feeling pretty isolated." "It gets easier," Sarah assured him, "but it takes time, and it helps to connect with other veterans who understand what you're going through." They talked for a few more minutes about resources on campus and in the community for veterans. Sarah gave Michael the contact information for Dr. Rivera and for a veteran support group that met weekly at the VA hospital. As people continued to leave the auditorium, Ashley from the Women's Leadership Council approached Sarah with obvious excitement. "That was amazing," she said enthusiastically. "I've never seen an audience that engaged with a speaker before. Would you consider doing more events like this?" Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure. Tonight was more intense than I expected it to be." "I understand if you need time to think about it," Ashley replied, "but I think you have something important to offer." A lot of students tonight were hearing these perspectives for the first time. Over the following days, Sarah received several emails from students who had attended the event. Most were positive, thanking her for sharing her experiences and offering new perspectives on military service. A few were from other veterans on campus who had been inspired to connect with her and with each other. One email that particularly moved her came from Jessica, the young woman she had helped in the parking lot. "Sarah," the email read, "I wanted you to know that hearing you speak Thursday night helped me understand something important. When you helped me that night in the parking lot, I thought you were just naturally brave. Now I understand that your ability to handle that situation came from experiences that were probably very difficult, and that cost you something. I'm even more grateful for your help. And I'm sorry if my questions that night made you uncomfortable. I hope we can be friends." Sarah found herself smiling as she read the message. It was exactly the kind of understanding she had been hoping to create. Not hero worship or pity, but genuine recognition of the complexity of military service and its aftermath. The most unexpected response came from Tyler Matthews, who sent her a long email detailing the research he had begun doing about women in combat roles and veteran transition issues. He had also volunteered to help with a campus initiative to create better support resources for student veterans. "I realized that my ignorance was willful," he wrote. "I was choosing not to educate myself about things I felt comfortable having opinions about. That's going to change." Sarah forwarded Tyler's email to Dr. Rivera, who wasn't surprised by the response. "People are often more capable of growth than we give them credit for," Dr. Rivera observed during their next session. "Sometimes they just need someone to hold up a mirror and show them what their assumptions actually look like." 3 months later, Sarah was approached by the university's administration about developing a formal program to support student veterans and educate the broader campus community about military service and veteran issues. The proposal included funding for peer counseling, educational workshops, and regular speaker events. Sarah accepted the position, with the understanding that she would be able to maintain her focus on her own studies while gradually building the program. It felt like the right balance between sharing her experiences constructively and maintaining the privacy she needed to continue processing her own transition. The coffee shop where this all began became a regular meeting place for the informal group of student veterans that began gathering around Sarah's initiative. Frank Morrison occasionally joined them, bringing decades of perspective on veteran issues and civilian-military relations. Tyler Matthews also became a regular attendee, having discovered that listening to veteran experiences was more educational than any political science class he had taken. His transformation from skeptic to advocate became a model for the broader education work that Sarah hoped to accomplish. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her familiar corner table reviewing applications for the new veteran support program, she overheard a conversation between two students at a nearby table. One was explaining to the other why she had decided to join ROTC. "I used to think the military was just for certain types of people," the student was saying. "But after hearing Sarah Mitchell speak last semester, I realized that service members are just regular people who've chosen to do something really difficult. I want to be part of something that matters." Sarah smiled to herself, remembering her own decision to join the Army years earlier. The motivations were different, but the underlying desire to contribute something meaningful was the same. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Rivera, reminding her about their appointment the following day. The weekly sessions had become less about crisis management and more about continued growth and development. Sarah had learned to carry her military identity openly but comfortably, without hiding from it but also without being defined entirely by it. The scars on her arm were visible now more often than not. She had stopped automatically choosing long sleeves, stopped positioning herself to hide the evidence of her service. They were part of her story, but they weren't the whole story. As she gathered her materials to leave the coffee shop, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first day, when she had overheard students questioning whether women like her really existed. The conversations were still happening, but they were more informed now, more respectful and more likely to include actual veterans' voices. It wasn't perfect and there was still work to be done. But it was progress, and Sarah had learned that sometimes progress was enough.